Okay, and continuing to discuss the essential elements, we've got two main groups of essential elements, and they're grouped based on the relative amounts that plants use. We've got the macronutrients, macro meaning large, and we've got the micronutrients, micro meaning small. And true to their names, macronutrients are needed in greater amounts by plants, and in fact, they're needed in amounts greater than 500 parts per million, which is equivalent to greater than 0.05% of the total plant mass. And micronutrients are needed in smaller amounts, and amounts less than 100 parts per million, which is less than 0.01%. Okay, so keep in mind both of these groups are essential nutrients. So even though a plant needs much less of a micronutrient like, let's say, copper than it needs a macronutrient like nitrogen, if it does not have enough copper, it will be just as dead as if it does not have enough nitrogen. So they're both still essential to plant growth. They're just needed in differing amounts. One is not more essential than the other. All right, we're going to start going through the essential nutrients now, and we're going to talk about physiological roles of the nutrients. And what a physiological role is, that just means what is the element needed for on the molecular level. Okay? We're not talking about nicknames for the nutrients or any sort of trivial kind of information about the nutrients. We want to know specific uses within the plant. And so we'll start with the macronutrients. And we're going to take the first three as a group, and those first three are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These three elements are needed in amounts greater than any other nutrients. Fortunately for plants, they are easily available to them from air and from water. So we'll say plants obtain from air in the form of CO2 and water in the soil. Now, these carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens are incorporated into all kinds of organic compounds. Organic compounds contain all three of these as a rule. The vast bulk of them get incorporated into making carbohydrates or sugars and starches, which is why we use CHOs as shorthand for carbohydrates. So we don't see deficiencies of carbon, hydrogen, or oxygen because there's air and usually there's plenty of water. In fact, I guess you could say a deficiency of hydrogen would be a drought condition, but we don't typically call that a deficiency in carbon, hydrogen, or oxygen. The next nutrient on the list is nitrogen, and this is one of the so-called big three nutrients. Nitrogen is relatively mobile within plants, which means its deficiency symptoms will turn up in the older tissues first. And it plays a lot of different roles within plants, most notably its structural role in amino acids. And amino acids are what we refer to as the building blocks of proteins. The pumps and the channels that we were talking about when we talked about active and passive transport are made up of proteins. Ribosomes are made up of proteins. All the enzymes in any organism are made of proteins. And so, as you could imagine, there's quite a bit of nitrogen needed by not just plants, but by all organisms. Another one that's specific to plants is nitrogen is a structural component of chlorophyll. And chlorophyll, as we're going to talk about very shortly, is the main pigment involved in photosynthesis, and so that's extremely important to plants. It is a part of its structure. And then we'll list finally here, it's also a part of the structure of the so-called nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, which are involved in storing and interpreting the so-called genetic code of the plant. The next nutrient on our list is phosphorus, which is also one of the big three, and it is mobile within plants, although it's immobile in soils, and you'll get to that in soils class. Phosphorus is a component of what are called phospholipids, which I've mentioned before briefly are what membranes are made out of. So basically you could just say membranes as a physiological role for phosphorus and you would be correct. Phosphorus is also part of the structure of a molecule called ATP, and we talked about that recently, and I always drew the comic book explosion around it, and basically that is used for energy transport, or let's say energy reactions. P is short for phosphorus, and there it is right in the name. Phosphorus, like nitrogen, is also part of DNA and, not DNO, DNA and RNA molecules. So those are three main physiological roles for phosphorus. The third of the big three is potassium. And potassium's symbol is a little confusing if you're not familiar with chemistry, in that it is a K. You would think it might be a PO or something, but P is already taken by phosphorus. The Greek word for potassium is kalium, and so potassium got stuck with K as a symbol. Potassium is also mobile within the plant. It's extremely mobile within the plant and is highly soluble. And it happens to be the only of the macronutrients that isn't incorporated into any particular molecule. It stays in an ionic form. And this one role we've already talked about in this class is that it is used to control the stomata. In other words, that is pumped into and out of the guard cells to control whether or not the stomata are open. And you can use one word to describe that, and we would call that in general terms osmoregulation of the plant. So extremely important to plants, as are all of these, because they're all essential nutrients. Our next nutrient on the list is calcium. And calcium is relatively immobile in plants. And so its deficiency symptoms tend to occur in younger tissues first, as opposed to the other ones that we've talked about so far. Calcium is heavily involved in cell division. It has a structural role in the formation of microfibers and microtubules that make up what we call the spindle fibers. And we'll talk more about what spindle fibers are later in the class when we get to cell division. Calcium is also a component of cell walls. So we can say cell wall structure. And it is also known as what's called a secondary messenger. It involves hormone systems. Next on our list, keeping with the macronutrients, is magnesium, and that's Mg for short. Magnesium is relatively mobile within plants. And it is also, with nitrogen, a structural component of chlorophyll molecules. So the green pigments that allow photosynthesis to happen cannot exist without magnesium. And so that's a pretty big role within plants. It's also involved in the activation of numerous types of enzyme systems. And that's a little more general description, but you should definitely know that it is part of the structure of chlorophyll. The last of the macronutrients is sulfur, symbolized by capital S. Sulfur is immobile within plants, and its deficiency symptoms should turn up, therefore, in the younger tissues first. Sulfur is a structural component in many of the amino acids. And as we said under nitrogen above, amino acids equals proteins. And so sulfur is important to anything and everything involving proteins, which also includes various enzyme systems. And that wraps it up for the macronutrients. So let me put a dividing line here, and we'll continue down our list with the micronutrients. And keep in mind the micronutrients are needed in lesser amounts, but they're no less essential than the macronutrients. The first of the micronutrients on our list is iron, and iron is symbolized by capital F and lowercase e. And for the micronutrients, we're not going to get into mobility with them. We'll talk about that more in other classes. We're just going to put down some physiological roles for a few of them, and the others we'll use some general physiological roles for. But iron is one that we can specifically list as being involved in photosynthesis. And when we talk about photosynthesis in detail later, we'll talk specifically about nitrogen's role in photosynthesis. So it's a biggie in terms of the micronutrients. And by the way, we're listing these micronutrients in order of the amounts by which a plant needs to have them to survive. Next greatest amount of the micronutrients is manganese, which is also involved in photosynthesis. Okay. Copper comes next on the list. It's involved in various enzyme systems, particularly some of the so-called scavenger type enzymes that we could say microbodies we talked about. There's one called superoxide dismutase, which contains copper as a component. Moving down the list, we've got Cl for chlorine. Chlorine involved in photosynthesis. Zinc, also on the list, involved in various enzyme systems. Boron, involved in sugar transport across membranes. Oops. And let me just come over here for the last two. We've got also molybdenum, which has a role in nitrogen metabolism. In other words, the incorporation of nitrogen into amino acids in DNA and RNA, etc. And then finally, we've got nickel, which is also involved in nitrogen metabolism and has in more recent years been shown to be vital to seed germination. So, to summarize quickly, what do I expect you to know? Well, for our purposes, I expect you to know what all of these essential nutrients are, and I expect you to know specific physiological roles for the macronutrients: N, P, K, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and also iron. We'll add iron to the list as knowing a specific physiological role. As far as the micronutrients are concerned, I want you to know what they are, okay, and be able to tell me what all of the micronutrients are. But in terms of physiological roles, most of them, for the most part, if you just said they're involved in some sort of enzyme system, you would be correct. However, they are still just as essential as the macronutrients. Some of them will pop up here and there in the course of the semester in the rest of this class, but the ones that we're most often concerned with in terms of fertilizing are the macronutrients and iron.